initially, whether or not he should even be associated with it. And of course, Crowley was famous for writing things himself under different names to give the AA the illusion that it had more people involved with it than it did. He even actually, and if you look at the letters to Harris that are online, there's a chunk of it at the end, which is an open letter from the Society of Hidden Masters, which is sort of a criticism of Crowley, putting out this book of the tarot, saying, you know, oh, you shouldn't do this. Like, you've done this, this, and this. You're clearly trying to do this, this, and this when you're putting out this book, and it's very kind of scolding, which was published in newspapers and whatnot as an open letter to Aleister Crowley from the Society of Hidden Masters, which of course Crowley wrote himself to attack himself publicly, to try to, I guess, in a way, it's actually really good to read, because the way that he chooses to attack himself reveals very clearly what his intentions were with the tarot. It's in a way his explanation of the Book of Thoth, which he does in trying to fight himself, I guess. But again, like, this is him, like, going back to his own reputation and trying to distance his reputation from his work, just so that people will read it seriously, will take it seriously. So that was a big concern of his. So this brings us sort of up into our modern era. Crowley died shortly after this came out. And then we have sort of a waning in occultism that happened for a few years until the 70s, where occult books began to be published more and more, and you started to see publishing companies spring up that were specifically devoted to publishing occult books. Which brings us to the main point of the trajectory. We go back to Martin Luther. Why was Protestantism possible? What made the Protestant Reformation possible? The answer to that question is more or less, and most people would identify it as, the printing press. It's one thing to tell people that they can interpret the Bible for themselves, but it's kind of hard when they can't get their hands on a copy, because everything's handwritten, and copies of these books are tremendously expensive and difficult to come by, and it's all in Latin. The printing press made it possible for Luther to publish the Bible in a way that it had never been published before. It became accessible. It was technology, and technology is the philosopher Martin Heidegger essentially says that technology is a means of revealing, a way of revealing truth. And he was writing around this time too, and he says that technology is essentially the new metaphysics, or it is the metaphysics for our time, because we no longer reveal. It will give us a new way to understand information, and at every step of the way, technology is what does it. With Dee and Kelly, the Enochian spirits are giving them a technology in and of themselves, but Dee, in his understanding of the world, was completely a technological revolution. He had an original Mercator globe. He was probably the first person in the British Isles to have a globe and be able to look at the world in that way, to understand the parts of the earth as the Enochian angels were explaining them in that way, to be able to visualize it and see it. The technology that he himself came up with was a large part of what made the British Empire so powerful. Navigation, nautical techniques that he came up with prefigured the supremacy of the British Navy, and they used his techniques to found things like the British East India Company, which made inroads into the East, and was largely, in spite of, it was a tyrannical, horrible thing if you look at it from the perspective of the people living in India at the time, but it also brought culture to the British Isles that didn't exist there before. And certainly Alan Bennett, who was sort of Crowley's introduction to yoga, well, he learned this in Ceylon, what's now Sri Lanka. He wouldn't, like, Buddhism and Hinduism made their impact in the West strictly due to what initially started as sort of an economic takeover, which began with the British and Dutch India companies, when they kind of went in there and started to take spices and goods, gold, all kinds of the things that they found there, they brought back, but they also brought back ideas, and they were influenced by that thinking. So that's when the East and West first sort of started to come together. And of course, Bennett was the one who founded the first Buddhist society in England, which still exists today. Literally, that brought the cultures together in a sense. Although, of course, there were tremendous tragedies that happened as a result of that. The breakup of Greater India was a horrible thing, and the conflict between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that's all still happening today, and you can trace all of that back to England sticking their hand in, or in Sri Lanka. where Bennett was studying, where Crowley learned about Buddhism. And really, that school of Buddhism, the Sinhalese school of Buddhism, was more in line with Crowley's idea of Buddhism. I mean, when he talks about Buddhism, he's really talking about Sinhala Buddhism, as opposed to what you might see in India or in Japan or in China, because that's where he learned his stuff. And you can completely trace the conflict that's happening there between the Buddhists and Hindus back to the British coming in and meddling, because they transliterated Buddhist texts into English, and then for political reasons, because leaders in the community there wanted to be able to bolster their political ideas with religious things. They wanted to be able to warp the text a little bit, so they translated them back into Sinhalese from the English translation. So if you translate something from one alphabet and language into another alphabet and language, and then move it back from that transliteration, you have all kinds of room to monkey around with what it actually says. It makes it very easy to fuck with the program, and that's sort of what happened. That's what happened there. And that connection, again, we can trace that right back to British nautical technology, which is where D becomes significant. And again, when Crowley shows up, printing is fairly regular. You know, books are now an industry. He's able to do things like he was doing with Book 4 and with 777, with the Book of Thoth, and the technology there is improving. Although Crowley himself was kind of a little anti-technology. He really didn't like the idea that you would have a device in your house that you couldn't fix yourself if it broke. Like, that's one thing that he rails against. And, you know, we can see this in rapidly accelerate modern times. I mean, I am old enough to remember VCRs, and I remember early VCRs where I could, if it broke, open it up and fix it. It wasn't a problem. You could tell what was broken because there was a thing that wasn't where it was supposed to be. You can't, like, and of course now they don't make devices that you can't even open up, and if you do open it up and you can't fix it yourself, then you've voided any warranty or whatever. So they definitely do not encourage do-it-yourself technology at all. Which kind of, and again, this industry, which started with Crowley, accelerated in the 70s, and brings us up to the modern era with the internet, where now, of course, you know, a lot of the people who come to these things wouldn't find out about them without the internet, or people who get these ideas wouldn't have found out about them without the internet. And people can study these books because really it was in the early 90s that all this stuff started to come online, and that was a huge explosion. I mean, me, myself, you can't, where I come from in New Brunswick, you can't buy a Crowley book. You have to drive for 8 hours to get to a city where they might actually sell something like that. So for me, in like 1996, there was no occult material around me, but I had the internet, so I could find these things pretty quickly and pretty easily. Which means that all of a sudden now, you're no longer restrained by a place. The information isn't localized. You don't have to go to a big library and study for hours and hours. You can just kind of do a word search and figure it out, which I'm sure people like Levy and Crowley and Dee would have loved. Like, you can't even imagine the countless hours that they must have spent, you know, poring over books trying to find this, that, or the other piece of obscure information, which is actually kind of what helps. What Crowley says, you know, the average working person wouldn't have time to do this. Well, we have a lot of things that give us shortcuts, and makes it a lot more possible to actually, you know, kind of hold down a job and still, you know, study these things and find these things out. So the question is, where is the enemy today? Like, what is this thing? In Liber 418, in the sixth Aether is where sort of the angels are talking about this, and it actually refers, this one, it was a direct reference to Martin Luther, as it says the master of the magician. He sort of says that Kelly was the spiritual heir of Luther in a way, and just says that you know, the only reason that he didn't go along with that idea of the Protestant Reformation was he just saw it would cause more trouble than the Catholics did. What we have essentially is a decimation of information, where what originally came out from the Catholic system, where you had people interpreting it, now you have people interpreting it for themselves. And of course, people don't generally have any fucking clue what they're talking about. So it's very easy to take these books and read whatever you feel like reading into it, which is sort of what gives rise to what we see in the southern U.S. and stuff like that, where people have completely insane interpretations of the Bible, which they feel are justified because it's their interpretation, whatever.